Many of us use it, but how much can we trust artificial intelligence? Recently, ChatGPT recalled an update after complaints that it was too sycophantic. While other chatbots have been accused of giving dangerously bad advice, one even blamed for a suicide. So is AI giving us what we want or provoking destabilizing behavior? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is artificial intelligence. Conversations with artificial intelligence can feel like you're talking to a friend, and that's what it's built to do. But as with actual friends, sometimes they tell you what you want to hear rather than the truth. Now, recent studies have shown chatbots can be far more persuasive than humans, putting us at higher risk of manipulation. So is the recent ChatGPT rollback an indication of more complicated issues to come, or a sign that engineers are trying to control the tech? Here's a look.
You will talk to ChatGPT over the course of your life. At someday, maybe if you want, it'll be listening to you throughout the day and sort of observing what you're doing. And it'll get to know you, and it'll become this extension of yourself, this companion, this thing that just tries to help you be the best, do the best you can.
This is one of the visions that OpenAI CEO Sam Altman has for ChatGPT. He wants a model that you don't just go to for an answer, but one that proactively pushes things that help you. And now, with an estimated 10% of the world using the platform daily, its uses are expanding. People are turning to AI chatbots for practical advice, sometimes revealing their most private thoughts and experiences. Recently, some accused a new updated version of ChatGPT of being overly sycophantic, even encouraging dangerous acts. In one example, the chatbot praised a user for standing up for themselves after they said that they'd stopped taking medications and left their family. After similar examples took social media by storm, OpenAI said the update was responsible for the sycophantic responses and rolled back the changes.
It aimed to please the user not just as flattery, but also as validating doubts, fueling anger, urging impulsive actions, or reinforcing negative emotions in ways that were not intended. Beyond just being uncomfortable or unsettling, this kind of behavior can raise safety concerns, including around issues like mental health, emotional over-reliance, or risky behavior.
The company said it was working to address the issue and admitted that people are now using ChatGPT for deeply personal advice, and that the model was not fully ready for that. And it's not only ChatGPT. Other AI chatbots have been called out for similar and even more harmful advice. A lawsuit in Texas alleges that a chatbot encouraged a 17-year-old to kill his parents after they limited his screen time. In another case in Florida, an AI model was accused of pushing a teenager to suicide.
This system's being designed to always validate rather than challenge what the user is saying. That gets more dangerous whenever you say things like, I don't think my family cares about me. I'm thinking about hurting myself. That can turn the conversation risky and in a very emotionally fraught way and reinforce very harmful beliefs and ultimately lead to harmful behavior.
Some countries, in particular the EU, are attempting to regulate AI, but they're struggling in the face of American lobbying and the lightning advances being achieved with the technology. The recent cases concerning ChatGPT and other models are again raising issues of ethics and dangers, and of how humankind will find a balance between itself and artificial intelligence.
So with laws and regulations always lagging behind the technology, what exactly should we be aware of regarding the potential dangers of AI? Joining me now to debate that and much more are from Newcastle, technology journalist and author Chris Stokel-Walker, and from Charlottesville, Virginia, assistant professor of data science and media studies at the University of Virginia and host of Co-opting AI, Mona Sloan. Thanks all so much for being with me. Chris, I'll start with you because you wrote a great piece in The Guardian about the ChatGPT Uturn on its update for really just being too sycophantic. So first explain what that was all about and what it says to you about the technology itself.
Well, fundamentally, this was all about, I suppose, the change in which we saw the behavior of ChatGPT to everyday users. So previously, it had adopted a kind of tone of being helpful, but sort of a little bit aloof. And then early in May, we saw the switch literally being flipped almost, where actually suddenly it started to become a little bit clingy, a little bit too praiseworthy, a little bit too sycophantic and a suck up. And actually, it unnerved people. And we learned since then that what had happened was the makers of ChatGPT, OpenAI, had rolled out an update to their latest model, 4.0, which is the one that powers most interactions that people use by default. And actually, that had resulted in the model having an almost change in personality that we could perceive, where actually it decided that it wanted to try and butter us up and make us feel a little bit better, but it actually misjudged it. I think this is one of the things that is particularly interesting about AI models is they attempt human interaction and to try and produce facsimiles of that, but they can't really do it very well. So whereas a human might have tapped the brakes and said, actually, this is a little bit creepy now, the AI went full bore into trying to persuade us that it thought we were brilliant. And that actually ended up having the opposite effect of concerning us all.
Should we say then, congrats to ChatGPT and OpenAI for walking it back?
I think that it's good that they walked it back. I think that it's concerning that actually they put out such a significant update that changed the personality of a model that is used by hundreds of millions of people worldwide without necessarily telling us. It was kind of snuck out, and then they had to admit it when something went wrong, and they had to go, well, actually, we will roll it back. But I do think that it is good that they changed it. I do think that it maybe might have been a bit of a shot across the bows for them in terms of actually what impact this can have, and just small tweaks to what they think of as their underlying model can have ripple effects that are felt far further than just the users.
Yeah. So Mona, you've actually said that you're worried about AI systems because they're known to hallucinate. Explains what that means, to users and why you think it could be dangerous.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So when generative AI systems hallucinate, that means that they are creating words, facts, meaning where none exist. So you could think of maybe a pause you have in your speech, and then you have a generative AI system that transcribes your speech, and then all of a sudden words appear, facts appear, things you never said, things that aren't true. And so that is a real risk. And it's a risk that heightens as we actually integrate these systems into higher stakes situations. We can think about the medical sector, we can think about the court system, we can think about education, we can think about transcription services that are used in the political system, and so on. And so when hallucinations occur, we don't necessarily notice. We really have to look at the transcript, at the text that was produced to identify that something wasn't wrong. And I'm really worried that with the increasing integration of generative AI systems into our everyday life, we are forgetting that we actually have to do that. And these sort of hallucinations sort of start to pop up and become new data that is used to further train the system.
Right. So that even challenges the people that are most aware of what's going on. They can easily be tricked. So Chris, you agree, Mona, yeah?
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's much to be said in terms of learning about how these systems actually get integrated into social situations, into professional practice, into these high stakes situations, and how people actually use them and understand their outputs. And we don't know enough about that yet.
Right. So, I mean, Chris, so if we're even talking about the more aware users, let's look at the other end of the spectrum, the people that are less aware, and to what extent users are fully responsible themselves for, mistaking chatbots for actually kind of being friends, even mental health professionals. It's been documented now that they're built to maximize engagement, these chatbots. So shouldn't the user know better? Or really, how vulnerable are they going to be?
I think that the user will have to become better prepared for these sorts of things. But actually, I think that Mona's point is very important. It's one that we ought to highlight. The way that these systems are designed is to try and mimic human interaction, and every choice that is made by the companies that produce these systems is designed to try and get you to forget that you are interacting with a computer. They are meant to try and pretend that they are being human. They do everything from having names. Some of them have names like Claude or other systems like that. They will also kind of have that interaction that we have with human beings in the chat interface. And so everything that is done here is designed to try and get you to forget what is going on in terms of behind the scenes and under the hood. And that becomes, I think, a very complicated process for everyday users because truthfully, most people's tech literacy is pretty low, pretty poor. They don't really know how, for instance, the last generation of technology, social media, works in terms of the algorithms that dictate our interests and then show us content that chimes with our passions and our projects and things that we like and things that we dislike. So when you start to layer in AI into all aspects of our lives, as Mona said, which makes it even higher stakes, and when you start to have a system that isn't just designed to present content to us, but is designed to try and present content to us in a way that humans would recognize as human interaction, then suddenly things become much more muddled.
Right. So Mona, I mean, how much could, vulnerable people be led into scams, or pushing people toward advertisers, or even, taking investment and banking advice based on nefarious interests of the people using the technology? How really dangerous is that? I mean, we've seen just human interaction, how especially older people become victims of scams. Now, if it's our company at home engaging us constantly on an AI basis on our phones, what does that open the door to?
I think the jury is still out on that, and it's a very important question. What I always like to say is that artificial intelligence is a scaling technology, and if there is malicious intent, then it can actually scale that as well. It can also scale inequality, it can scale social problems, it can scale misinformation, and we've already seen that, right? So when I say these systems get baked into everyday practices, social interactions, and so forth, these situations already exist, and so it can scale up the problems that are happening there. I think that we are going to see more of that. I am a little bit more optimistic than Chris, perhaps, because what I'm also seeing in my research as a social scientist is that people are actually becoming sort of AI experts in their own right. Yes, we don't necessarily know how the systems actually work. They are black boxed in all kinds of ways, but people actually do find out when there's a system at work and when it works well for them and when it doesn't work well for them, and tweak the system. So I'm a little bit more hopeful that people will adopt an AI literacy much quicker than we think, but that depends on us as researchers, as journalists, as scholars, to actually have these kinds of conversations, the conversation that we have now, so that we reach a level of literacy on that foundational technology that we really need.
Glad you say that, because Chris, on the other side of the spectrum, there are many who say that AI is just making us dumber. It's taking away our critical thinking skills, and it's making us trust algorithms more than we trust our own judgment.
I think that is a valid concern. I think that we're in this kind of odd phase at the minute of adoption of this technology where we forget often actually we are still 3 years less into the generative AI revolution, the kind of post-ChatGPT release that we saw, and actually dealing with the ramifications of this. It's kind of like flying a plane while it's still being built and simultaneously not really knowing how to control it properly. There are very strong arguments that can be said that actually the use cases that we are developing right now for generative AI tools like ChatGPT might not be the best use cases for them. We might not find that actually interacting in a chat window, trying to get it to produce reports and things like that is the most efficient way that we can use this technology. There might be ones that we haven't thought about yet, but I think that that is an interesting moment for us, and actually one where we do do have to try and improve, because the reality is that if we don't get to grips with this, then we do run the risk of things being left behind. And certainly we've seen, I suppose, the kind of the people who are really keen on AI and are proponents of how this is going to be used, saying this is going to be everywhere in our lives. So I think it is important that we kind of get to grips with it, start to try and understand it, and then from that we can maybe figure out the best use cases and the benefits.
So Mona, let me ask you this. You know, from a social standpoint, if you've done this kind of research, if you can tell us proportionately, for how many people are AI and chatbots a kind of comforting link to something that stimulates kind of needed company, or simulates, I should say, simulates needed companies was what sometimes people feel like using AI. And then for how many is it just a manipulative force that's pretty detrimental to those vulnerable people out there? Do you have any idea of the proportionality of who's using it for good, who it's helping, and then who's really in danger?
I do not. I haven't run that research, but I will say this. AI is becoming an infrastructure that gets baked into other infrastructures that we already have, whether that is hard infrastructure such as the grid, or even, pipes, the water system, our transit system, or whether that is sort of softer infrastructures, information infrastructure, softwares that we use every day that increasingly have AI baked into them. And so within the use of these infrastructures, there are many instances in which people routinely interact with AI, and specifically generative AI. If you think about your word processing software, for example, I'm not sure if there is a general thinking about generative AI and chatbots as companions at this point. I will say, though, that there are certain instances that I'm familiar with, especially in the education sector, where, for example, students have begun to use generative AI as a sort of study companion, where they ask an AI system, for example, to explain a concept to them in more detail, to help them debug code if they're in a computer science class, and so forth. That's a slightly different notion of companion than I think what you're getting at, which is sort of a friend or even a romantic partner. And there's newer research that is coming out on that. But again, this is part of this sort of larger infrastructural change that we're seeing. So I think we will have to ask very nuanced questions around where in this sort of infrastructural shift we are making assumptions about what that system is, what it does for us, and how we create or co-create meaning through the interaction with that system.
Yeah. I know I saw some preliminary studies coming out of Japan where, robotics are seen as alternatives to human companionship, and AI is feeding into that. So it'll be another space, but I think it's more prevalent in parts of East Asia. But Chris, let me come back to you, because we need to talk about the potential legal complications, I guess, if AI is deemed responsible for encouraging dangerous behavior. Somewhat like you would have to hold a mental health care professional responsible for not acting ethically.
And the problem with this is that this is far from being settled, because we are in such an early stage of adoption of this technology. So if you ask the AI companies themselves, and they would absolutely say that it is not their responsibility. These are platforms, these are tools that people use, in the same way that you wouldn't necessarily have, for instance, a gun manufacturer sat in the dock to be responsible for the murder of someone with a loaded weapon like that. They should not be responsible for the actions of their users. Now, that is, I guess, an argument that could be made, although there are, I suppose, some differences in this. One of the things that we have touched on a little bit in this conversation is the kind of emotionally manipulative aspect that AI can have, and that is both deliberate in some ways, but also accidental in others. There's no kind of guarantee or reasoning or coding that says we want you to encourage people to partake in bad behavior, although actually some AI models that are available under open source licenses, which means that they can be used and then kind of adapted. We have seen people trying to get rid of the guardrails that tech companies put in to try and prevent sort of nefarious behavior happening. So in some instances, you can have chatbots that maybe might encourage you, for instance, to have suicidal ideation or to allow you to develop drugs and things like that. That is one element of the kind of nefarious underworld of AIs. In terms of in the mainstream, that is absolutely kind of limited and stopped from happening. But I think that we will see people trying to test this in courts and saying, actually, you made my child feel awful to the extent that this is happening. And we kind of have past precedent, I suppose, in the way that, for instance, in the UK, relatively recently, we saw a coroner saying that social media platforms were directly responsible for the death of a child because they pummeled them with negative imagery that caused them to take their own life. So while we might not necessarily see, I suppose, a kind of legal case of big tech companies being held directly responsible for a death in the same way that a human might, they might well be seen as kind of being a contributory factor that exacerbated some of the behavior that a human might already have had.
Yeah. Like I said, laws always lag behind the technology. We'll have to see how the legislation really develops. And speaking of legislation, Mona, we'll remember last year when current and former employees of OpenAI actually wrote that open letter warning of very serious risks to the public in moving forward with AI development. At this point, do you think those risks have been addressed significantly, or are we in danger? Because we know the EU tried, but has apparently failed, to regulate some new AI models, and they're actually being fought by the United States.
Yeah, that is an ongoing conversation, as Chris put it. The attempts that were made by the European Union to regulate artificial intelligence, I think, were good. They particularly moved the AI regulation conversation towards a risk-based framework, which I think is pretty useful because it allows us to think about what are the actual harms that can occur through the deployment of these systems. They've also thought about pre-market deployment testing and post-market deployment testing and documenting those harms and those tests. So it's a very ambitious regulation. It came at a point in time where generative AI was sort of starting to enter the scene, and as a foundation technology, it shored up new kinds of questions that this framework wasn't quite ready to address. So it's quite unfortunate that that happens, but I'm hopeful that actually we will see, as the EU AI gets enacted in the European Union, how we can actually use that technology or use the regulation to put guardrails around the technology. Now, here in the US, we don't have a comprehensive AI regulation. We do have a lot of activity on the state level when it comes to AI regulation. Those are specific regulations that focus, for example, on the use of AI in schools or by law enforcement or public agencies and so forth. So it's a little bit more of a patchwork. When it comes to the risks that the OpenAI people have warned of, I'm a little worried about the conversation moving towards the risks that are going to flow from a future general artificial intelligence, sort of a super intelligence, the Terminator that's going to
that we lose control of,
erase humanity. And I think that's a very unhelpful conversation because it's theoretical and it distracts us from the actual risks and harms that are already occurring, that already occurred before generative AI entered the scene, as AI systems were baked into insurance, medical, and so on. So that's a problem in terms of how we frame the conversation. So I think there are good attempts here and there. There's a polarized public discourse that we're seeing that is, entrenched in hyping.
We're kind of down to our last minute and a half. So I want to get Chris's take on that as well, because, maybe the alarmist tone is counterproductive, but at the same time, when you have actual engineers of AI saying that this could cause human extinction and that, we feel like we could potentially be trapped in some kind of Black Mirror episode if this isn't controlled, is it alarmist? These are the guys that should know.
I guess I would say to that, every parent thinks that their child is the most talented, the most gifted, and the artwork that they put on their refrigerator every night is going to be hung alongside a Picasso in an art gallery. And actually, I think there is a risk here that when we get too close to the technology, we start to think that it is amazing and brilliant. Generally, amongst the scientific community, there is a consensus opinion that actually the risk of a kind of Terminator scenario is very minimal. In reality, that is in some ways a different discussion that we might have to have in the future. There are arguments on both sides that either this is a willful distraction by those who are most close to the technology to try and distract us from the real and present risks that we can sort now, but would limit the development of artificial intelligence right now. There are other arguments that say that actually this is a validly held opinion by people, but they are maybe just a little bit misguided. I think regardless of that, we have enough problems at the minute with AI technology that could be solved if we all get together and start to think about how we come up with solutions rather than thinking about those issues 20, 30 years in the line that are perhaps only a 0.0001% chance of happening.
Chris, that's going to have to be the final word. I'd really like to thank you and Mona for being with me on this edition of the Newsmakers. Fascinating discussion. Our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media. And do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.